Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned?
Thank you, and for the introduction and for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I know non-economists aren't always excited about economics, but economists are excited to talk about economics all the time, at least the type of economist that I studied with that Tom mentioned. So I'm here today to tell you that the way we've been thinking about money and deficits and government finances has all been wrong, and that we haven't been using our monetary system to harness the potential of our economy and build a better future for our grandchildren. So hopefully, I know a lot of this is going to challenge our preconceived notions about money, and I'm hoping we can all keep an open mind, given the lifelong learners that we all are, and just keep an open mind for the next half an hour to 20 minutes. I'm going to try to keep the presentation short and take as many questions as I can, because I know the topic usually invites a lot of questions. Okay? All right. So the presentation was open.
It's not going full screen.
Well, as long as I can navigate it, it's okay.
Can you do it?
Yeah, it works. All right. So let's start with what we all think we know about money and government deficits and government debt. And what we all know is that we have a debt clock, and it's ticking, and it's the amount of debt is increasing every second, and that this is debt that our grandchildren and their children will have to pay back at some point in the future, and that by running deficits, we're increasing our debt, and we're further burdening our grandchildren, because every dollar that we spend today in the form of government deficits has to be paid back at some point in the future. Now, there are two views on deficits, and both of those would be grouped under what I call conventional wisdom, or the conventional wisdom on deficits. And we have the deficit hawks and the deficit doves. And the hawks are the people who want a balanced budget every year. So year in, year out, we want to balance the budget, probably even create some rules for balanced budgets. We know a lot of state governments have rules for balanced budgets, mandates, it's in their constitution and so on. And then we have the deficit doves who say, well, it's okay to run a deficit in a recession, because in a recession, the private sector isn't spending, the public sector has to pick up the slack. But once we're out of it, we really need to try to balance the budget, or better, run a surplus. So over the business cycle, a recession and a recovery, the budget would be balanced. So the deficits would be offset by surpluses and so on. Okay? So you can tell that a lot of Republicans would be in the deficit hawk category, and a lot of Democrats would be in the deficit dove category. And what I'm going to talk about today is neither the doves nor the hawks. It's a different, alternative way to think about deficits. So what if it just ain't so, that we don't have to worry about balancing the budget, and that the way we've been thinking about deficits has been wrong? That's what I'm going to argue today. So it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so. So what if government deficits don't really take away from our children and grandchildren? China really isn't our banker, and the whole fear about China at some point not wanting to lend to us anymore, and our economy is going to crash when they decide to do so, and we're so worried about that, those fears are just misguided. And what if there is no long-term debt problem, like the debt clock seems to tell us there is? And what if running a government deficit isn't irresponsible? So that's what we want to explore. So there's another way to look at the deficit, and as an economist, of course, I had to put some numbers there. So here is a very simple example. Suppose the government spends $100 and it taxes 90. So we have a deficit because the government is spending more than its tax revenues. And in this case, the deficit would be $10. But the question that we don't usually ask is, where did that $10 go, right? And where it goes is into the private sector. So the government deficit is actually equal to the private sector surplus. So if we take our economy, and let's forget about the foreigners for now, I'll bring them in just a second, the foreign sector I mean. So if we break up our economy into the government sector and the non-government sector, or the private sector, every dollar of government deficit is a dollar of private sector surplus. This is not a theory, this is accounting, because those $10 cannot disappear. If they went out of somebody's pocket, they have to end up into someone else's. So if they went out of the government's pocket, they have to end up into the non-government sector's pocket. So as we can see in the graph, whenever the government sector, which is the red line there, whenever the government deficit increases, when it's going down, we're going deeper into the negative territory, so it's an increasing deficit, we see that the private sector surplus is increasing. This is accounting. Again, it's not a theory, it's just accounting so far. So we can break this down further. We can add the foreign sector. So that's our imports and exports, the trade that we do with the rest of the world. That's what economists usually call this, the rest of the world. So we know that the rest of the world has been running a surplus against the United States since basically the late 1970s, early 1980s. From our perspective, that's our trade deficit. So we're running a deficit with the rest of the world, which means they're running a surplus against the United States. So they're selling more to us than what we are selling to them, basically. So that's the green area there. Then we have the red area, which is the government. As we can see, the norm is for the government to be in the deficit territory. And that has been the norm not only since 1960s, but since the inception of the country. The United States has almost always run a budget deficit, I mean the federal government, and with only few exceptions. Now, one of the few exceptions is, of course, the Clinton surpluses that we see, right? They were short-lived and very small, although they were predicted to continue for years and years to come, and that did not materialize, of course. And then the blue line is the private sector. What we can see is that it is the norm for the private sector to run a surplus, and that's what we want. We do not want the private sector to be in the deficit territory, because that is clearly not sustainable. We did have a period when the private sector was running a deficit. That's around the time that we also had the Clinton surpluses. And of course, we all know how that ended up. The Great Recession, the Great Financial Crisis. The private sector took on too much debt and they could not pay it back. There was no way the private sector could continue servicing the debt. So we ended up with a lot of defaults, and a crashing economy. Okay, now, the other thing you will notice here is that this is a mirror graph, okay? And that's how it has to be, because this is accounting. So the balances of all three sectors have to add up to zero, because not all three sectors can run a surplus at the same time, just like not all three sectors can run a deficit. It's exactly what I was explaining in the previous slide, that somebody's surplus has to be offset by someone else's deficit. So if we have three sectors in the economy, some are running a surplus, some are running a deficit. If you add their balances, they have to add up to zero. Balances must balance. So what we see is that our government's deficit is the other side of the private sector surplus, okay? And since the 1980s, when we've been running the foreigners have been running a surplus against us, we've been running a deficit with the foreigners. That means that if we have that as a given, that we are importing more than what we're exporting, that if we take that as a given, and if we try to balance the budget, then our private sector will go into a deficit, like it did when Clinton achieved the surpluses that were so highly extolled. So just keep this in mind, that if the government is running a surplus and the foreigners are running a surplus, it means the private sector has to run a deficit. There is no other way around it. It is accounting. So if the foreigners' surplus is, let's say, 2% of our GDP, and if the government is running a surplus of 3% of our GDP, that's 5%. It means the private sector has to be running a deficit equal to 5% of GDP. No way around it, okay? So I'll be happy to take questions about this chart. This is what we call sectoral balances. So we divide the economy into sectors, and we then make, then we can say, well, if one of the sectors tries to balance the budget, what must happen to the other sectors? We cannot view one sector in isolation. We always have to consider what happens to the other sectors of the economy. And if we want a private sector surplus, when the foreigners are running a surplus against us and we're running a deficit with them, it means we have to have a government deficit. Otherwise, our economy is basically not going to work. So another way to think about this is that we need to try to balance the economy, or what we call injections and leakages into the circular flow income, rather than worrying about balancing the budget. So one way to think about this is that we have the water there in the tub represents our income, and we have additions and leakages, okay? So some things add to our income and other things are leakages. So investment is an addition to our income. It increases our income when firms invest more. Government spending adds to our income, and exports add to our income. So as you can see, all of these are sales, as I will talk about in just a second. Now, saving, taxes, and imports do the opposite. They are the drain. So we have the faucet, and then we have the drain. If we don't ensure that we are adding as much as is being drained out of the economy, then what's going to happen to the flow, to the level of water in the tub, is that it's going to decrease. So our income is going to decrease if we don't balance the injections and the leakages. So you all know, as most of you work in businesses or have your own businesses, is that a market economy runs on sales. So we need customers for the economy to keep going. So if we want to extend our recovery, the economic recovery, if we want to boost it, then we need to increase sales. We need more and more customers. And the customers are the domestic private sector, the government, and the foreign sector. So going back to the previous slide, right? So we have consumers and firms consuming and investing, we have the government spending, and we have foreigners buying stuff from us. Those are the customers. And if we don't have enough customers, well, this is what happens. What we have here is the actual GDP, the trajectory of our gross domestic product, which is the red line, and then we have the projections, okay? So the very top line is the projected trajectory of potential GDP, how much we could be producing if all of our resources, such as labor resources and factories, were all used. That's potential GDP. So the straight lines are our estimates for potential GDP. And look at what has happened. We have been lowering our estimates year after year after year. So in 2007, of course, we thought the economy was going to continue to grow and we're going to be in a much better position than we actually are, right? So if you take the difference between the red line and our estimates for how much we would be producing that we made in 2007, then we've lost a lot of potential output. So this is output that we could be producing, but we did not produce. Why did we not produce? Because we did not have customers, because the private sector wasn't spending, because the foreigners weren't buying enough from us, and because the government did not take up the slack. So if there isn't enough spending in the economy, not enough customers, it means we're losing the output we could be producing. Does this sound like service to our grandchildren or the opposite? I think it sounds like the opposite, right? So this is output we could be producing, increasing our productivity, which our grandchildren would be benefiting from in the future, but they're not, because we have forgone this output. real output. So now, so far, if we agreed that deficits can be beneficial, and in a sense, if we are running a trade deficit, then we have no other way but to run a government deficit as well. But where will we get the money? So Democrats say we have a revenue problem, so we need to tax more, right? Tax the rich more, or close the tax loopholes, this and that, so that we can collect more revenue. And the Republicans say, no, we have a spending problem, we're spending too much, and so on and so forth. And we don't have the money to do so. And the conventional wisdom is that Uncle Sam is broke, right? We don't have the money, the government is financially constrained. So the story goes as follows. If households have to balance their budget, right? They can't continuously run deficits, then the government is no different, right? I have to balance my budget. I mean, I can run a deficit for a year or two, maybe 20, but how long will that continue? It will not be sustainable, right? And the same seemingly applies to the government. If the government wants to spend more, it needs to borrow money, but of course there is a limitation to that too. What if the bond markets just refuse to lend to the US government, right? We're afraid of China stopping to lend to us, or Japan, or the other foreign countries that hold a lot of our debt. And if our debt gets too high, maybe we'll become insolvent, unable to pay our bills. The US government unable to pay our bills. If you really stop and think about it, you see that it doesn't sound like a very sensible idea. Now, what happened is that in 1971, the world changed. And it changed because Nixon took us off the gold standard. Now, some people think this was a bad thing, a scary thing, because the money is not backed by anything. It's not backed by gold or silver or anything real. In reality, it wasn't a bad thing. It was a good thing because it liberated our monetary system, allowing us to achieve more, to be able to produce more output that our grandchildren can benefit from in the future. And if you look at the history of money, then the gold standard, or tying the currency to gold, was a very brief period in human history. For most of human history, money has actually been fiat money, not backed by anything real, if you will. I mean, it is backed by something, which we can get into, but it's definitely not backed by gold. So in a system with fiat money, which is not backed by another currency or metal, the government finances its spending by crediting bank accounts. I mean, 20, 30 years ago, we would call that printing money. But of course, we don't print the money anymore. It all goes through the banks, right? So if you get a Social Security check, you don't get a check anymore, right? It's just a deposit into your bank account. So any payment from the government, you wake up one morning, and if the government owed you payment, you see that the balance in your account went up, okay? That's how governments spend. They tell their central banks to credit the bank's account, and then the bank credits the recipient's account. And I can explain that in more detail. So this basically amounts to changing numbers up and down on a spreadsheet. So when we spend, we change the number up. When we tax, we change the number down. And it's similar to how a stadium keeps score, okay? So the stadium never says, oh, we've run out of points, or we need to save points from a previous game so that in the future game we can award points, right? That sounds silly. Well, the same is true for the monetary system. The government is basically the scorekeeper for US dollar. And if you don't believe me, we can use the words of Ben Bernanke, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, who got us through the Great Recession. And he was asked by Scott Pelley during an interview, 60 Minutes, I think is the name of the program. So when the Fed was buying all these bonds, all these assets, everyone was wondering, well, where did the Fed get the money from? We didn't have an appropriation process through Congress, right? Like we did for the bank bailout. But the bank bailout was $700 billion, and that was chump change compared to what the Fed did. The Fed's bailout programs were in trillions, close to 4 trillion or 3.5. So he was asked, well, where do you get that money? Is that tax money you're spending? And Bernanke says, no, it's not tax money. We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account. So they mark up the size of the account of the bank, and the bank then marks up the size of the account of whoever sold the assets to the Federal Reserve. If we can do this for financial assets, buy $3.5 trillion worth of financial assets, why can't we do that to buy unemployed labor and build the roads and everything else that we need to do? The answer is we can. There is no constraint inherent in the monetary system that prevents us from doing so. The constraints are all self-imposed. And they actually go back to the gold standard pre-1971 thinking, when our currency was tied up with the gold. So here I have some examples of older currency. So on the top, you probably don't see this, but I've circled it in pink. It says, this certifies that there is on deposit in the treasury $1 in silver payable to the bearer on demand. This is currency that is tied to a metal, silver, okay? The same thing with the one at the bottom. What does a government bill say, a currency bill say today? It says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, okay? That's it. No promises to pay you anything. Well, the one at the bottom does promise to pay you something, and it's sort of silly because it says, we'll pay to the bearer on demand $100. So $100 bill is a promise to pay $100. So if you take it to the government, they'll give you 5 $20 bills, 100 $1 bills, but that's all, right? They don't promise to convert it into anything else. And like I said, this should not be a scary thing, as I will explain later, or we'll get into that during the Q&A. And of course, we don't say that on our notes anymore, right? That it's a promise to pay $100, because we know that that just doesn't make sense. All right, so is the government like a household? Well, it's not, because households and private firms are the users of the currency. Well, where does that currency come from? It must have been issued by someone. Well, the government is the monopoly issuer, the sole source of dollars that we use, that we have in our pockets, okay? The US government is the monopoly issuer of the currency. And if you put aside all your economics training, if you've had any before, or everything you thought you knew about the monetary system and thought about that, where does the dollar come from? Well, here I have actual dollars. I tell my students I print them in my basement, and they believed me. I did not print this in my basement. This is actual money that I bought from the Bureau of Engraving, Printing and Engraving, where the dollar is printed. And when it's not cut into dollar bills and you see it for what it is, right? It's printed on a piece of paper. It's a fancier paper, of course, and better quality ink, better than what I would have in my basement, but it's still the same, right? This is the nature of fiat currency. All right, so, and where did this come from? It came from the government. I had to pay $18 for this $5, of course, but because they're not cut, I guess they are, they're considered different. So, Uncle Sam can literally never run out of money. If you want to make a 2-hour trip and go to Washington, D.C. to the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, you will see where the dollars get printed. And we don't even use the paper anymore. It's all electronic, like the scoreboard that I explained before. And the dollars enter our economy through government spending, okay? So if the only source of dollars is the government must spend for the dollars to get into the economy. And what do you think happens when we pay our taxes? Does the government need to save the pieces of paper so that next time they need to spend, they can recycle the pieces of paper? The answer is no. If money was gold, they would need to recycle the gold, right? But if money is paper, saving the paper doesn't make sense. It just will probably cost a lot of money to store all the paper, right? And of course, it's all electronic. We do it through our banks. We don't even see it, how it works, right? The taxes, when we pay, we think we pay through our bank accounts. In reality, it has to go through the central bank. But the point is that taxation destroys money and government spending creates money. So if the government is spending more than it's taxing, running a deficit, it's creating more money, injecting more money into the economy than it's taking out, okay? And the dollars we need to pay our taxes must have entered the economy through previous government spending. Logically, there is no other way around that. So again, put aside all your economics training and think about this logically, right? The dollars must enter the economy first before we can get hold of them and then use them to pay our taxes. So taxes cannot really be a revenue for government. And we worry about continuous government deficits, that they're not sustainable. What about surpluses? Again, let's think together. Suppose the government runs a surplus year after year after year. So every year it's taking more money out of the economy than it's putting in. Are those sustainable? The answer is no. At some point, the private sector is going to run out of dollars with which to pay our taxes, because every year the government is taking out more money than it's putting in. So government surpluses is what's not sustainable, not the deficits. And again, I'm not the only one saying this or the person who came up with these ideas. I'm just a messenger. But we have, so don't shoot the messenger, but we have people in our central banks saying that as the sole manufacturer of dollars whose debt is denominated in dollars, the US government can never become insolvent, that is, unable to pay its bills. In this sense, the government is not dependent on credit markets to remain operational. And the statement is very much true. And even Alan Greenspan, who's a conservative, right, I guess arch conservative you could say, and he headed the Federal Reserve System for a very long time, said the following, and this was not the only way he said it many times, many different ways. The United States can pay any debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there is zero probability of default. So the whole story about how credit rating agencies are going to downgrade us and we're not going to be able to borrow anymore in the credit markets, that's just not true. I mean, look at Japan. They've been downgraded to junk bond status. Their debt to GDP ratio is like 230% of GDP. And has Japan been unable to borrow from the markets? The answer is no. It just continues with its business as usual and doesn't really face any constraints from the markets. So to summarize, a country that issues its own currency that is not tied with another currency or a metal like gold or silver has what we call monetary sovereignty. And that country can never be financially insolvent. So it does not face financial constraints on its spending. Now, this doesn't mean it doesn't face any constraints. It does face real constraints, real resource constraints, which I'll talk about in just a second. But the constraints are never financial. And if we pretend that they are, then we end up with foolhardy economic policies. And of course, it only applies to countries with their own currency. I mean, more often than not, countries have their own currency, especially developed countries. So most developed countries have monetary sovereignty. Of course, the exception is countries in the Eurozone who have given up their monetary sovereignty, adopted the euro, which is for all practical purposes a foreign currency. And look at what's happening in Greece, right? 25% unemployment for so many years. 1 out of every 2 young people aged 18 to 24 is unemployed, okay? That doesn't sound like a very good way to take care of the future of grandchildren. So what could we do? Well, once we understand how the monetary system works, we can build our infrastructure. I mean, year in, year out, we get a D+ from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Our infrastructure gets a D+ score. Doesn't sound very, very good. And if you go to other developed countries and you see their infrastructure, you wonder why we don't have the same. So the shortage of spending on infrastructure is $3.6 trillion. So much less than any proposal for rebuilding our infrastructure. And once we understand that we have a flexible monetary system, we can use that system to build our infrastructure. We can enhance the retirement security. We're constantly worried about not, having enough money in the Social Security so that people today will not be able to retire comfortably in the future. Well, if you think about it, retirement security isn't really about money. It's about whether we will have enough real resources in the future to provide for people who retire, right? Because at some point we're going to have fewer and fewer people working and more people who need to consume. So it's about real resources. Will we have enough real resources for everyone when fewer people are working and more people are retiring? Well, if that's really the issue, then if we cut spending today, that doesn't really help our productivity in the future, right? So we could be investing in research and development, things that would increase our productivity so we would have more real stuff for everyone in the future. And instead we worry about the money and so on and so forth, and we end up with the wrong solutions. The student debt crisis. I mean, if you look at what has happened to student debt, right, it's been skyrocketing and it's been increasing even faster since the Great Recession. So students taking on more and more debt, which is a drag on the economy because these people are going to graduate and they're going to get the jobs, but they're not going to be the customers we want, right? Because they have to use a lot of their income to pay back their student loans. And that doesn't make for a good economy when a lot of the income goes towards servicing the debt. Doesn't make a lot of customers. All right. Now, going back to the real constraints on government spending, just because the government is not financially constrained does not mean it doesn't face any constraints. It does have real resource constraints. So if the government keeps spending and we reach full employment and it continues to spend, right, so all the people are working, whoever is eligible and willing to work, we're using all of our factories, but the government says, I'm going to keep buying more. Well, what would we expect to happen? Inflation, right? Prices would start rising because the government would be beating up the prices. So just because it's not financially constrained doesn't mean we want the government to be the whole economy, right? We just want it to fill the gap that's left by the private sector, not more, not less. So if we have unemployment, that means the government isn't spending enough. If we have inflation, it means the government is spending too much or taxing too little. It's as simple as that. And this is the principle of functional finance as opposed to the principle of sound finance, which says we need to balance the budget year in, year out, or over some arbitrary period like the business cycle. So some examples of real constraints on government spending. Suppose there are 10 engineers and they're all employed by the private sector. And the government says, well, I need to hire engineers to build the roads and so on. It means it needs to bid those engineers away from the private sector. And how do you do that? By paying them more, right? Now, if you do that with enough, professions and enough stuff, then you can bid up the prices and cause inflation. So what I was explaining in just a second ago. Or if the economy can only produce 10 apples and the government wants to buy 4, it only leaves 6 to the private sector, right? So those are the real constraints on government spending. Whatever the government buys is stuff we can't buy anymore, right? Because the government basically took it away from the private sector. So how much should the government buy? If we can produce 10 apples and the private sector only wants to buy 8, it leaves 2 apples unsold, right? So people who produce the apples cannot sell the stuff, not enough sales. The 2 is what the government should buy, not more, not less. If it buys more, it means it's going to cause inflation. If it buys less, it means it's going to leave some people and some resources unemployed. All right, so to conclude, we always worry about deficits being too big, and we never worry about deficits being too small, but deficits can be too small. And as we saw with the Clinton surpluses, if we try to achieve surpluses, we're doing it at the backs of the private sector, and that led to a recession in 2001 and then led to the Great Recession in some sense later in 2007. So obstacles and threats where they don't exist, we've run out of money, the Chinese will no longer lend to us, we could end up like Greece or like Zimbabwe, which had hyperinflation. But in reality, when we succumb to those fears and threats which are not real, we are doing the service to our grandchildren, because we're not using our economy to its full potential, as I showed, and that's a foregone output that we cannot recuperate. And we're not investing in education or research and development, which is what we need to enhance the productivity of our economy and really serve our grandchildren in the future.